Greetings to everyone. We are going to learn about modern age. Main characteristics of modern literature. We are going to learn about this topic. Each and every age in the history of English literature has come different triads that distinguish from all other modernist or 20th century. The transition from the Victorian age to modern age was faster forward and backward. Modernism, best described as the literary and artistic period from the first of the 20th century. In the first of the 50th year of the 20th century, human race moved faster than during perhaps 50 generations in the past. The human race moved faster in industrialization and invention of technology with the help of that society lead to progress. There were spiritual regress, human race degraded in the matter of religion and spirituality. The modern age in literature was grounded in achievements that are amazing in the potential for both emancipation and destruction. What are the destructions did they face? Atomic energy, space exploration, genetic, biomedical engineering, and telecommunications. Technological advances in these areas could either save millions of human beings and the planet or destroy them several times over. They can free people from the bondage of disease, poverty, and oppression in worse conditions. The literature of the 20th century addressed this extreme situation of freedom and oppressions, fear and freedom from fear and achievements. Literature scholars differ over the years that encompass the modernist period. Modernist author published as early as the 1980s and in the mid 1940s. During this period, society at every level underwent profound changes. Global communications made the world a smaller place. The pace of the change was dizzying. Writer responded to the new world in the variety of ways. We are going to learn the first characteristics of individualism. In modernist literature, the individual is more interesting than society. Individual was given daily importance than society. Modernist writers were fascinated with how the individual adapted to the changing world. In some cases, the individual triumphed over the obstacles. Modernist literature featured characters who just kept their heads above water. What does it mean? Means individual was given main importance in this period. Writers presented the world or society as a challenge to the integrity of their characters. Ernest Hemingway is especially remembered for vivid characters who accepted their circumstances at face value and persevered. Second characteristic is experimentations. Modernist writer broke free of old forms and techniques. Poets abandoned traditional rhyme schemes and wrote in free verse. Novelists defied all expectations. Writers mixed images from the past with modern language and themes, creating a collage of styles. This preoccupation led to a form of narration called stream of consciousness, where the point of view of the novel meanders in a pattern resembling human thoughts. Authors James Joyce and Virginia Woolf, along with poet T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, are well known for their experimental modernist works. Third characteristic is absurdity. Several great English poets died or were wounded in the World War I. At the same time, global capitalism was reorganizing society at every level. For many writers, the world was becoming a more absurd place every day. The mysteries of life was being lost in the rush of daily life. Modernist authors depicted this absurdity in their works. Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis, in which a traveling salesman is transformed into an insect like creature, is an example of modern absurdism. Next characteristic is symbolism. Modernist writer used symbolism in their works. They infused objects, people, places, and events with significant meanings. They imagined a reality with multiple layers, many of them hidden or in short of code. The idea of their poem as a riddle to be cracked had its beginning in the modernist period. Symbolism was not a new concept in literature, but the modernist particular use of symbol was an innovation. They wanted to mean something through symbols. That is called symbolism. They left much more to the reader's imagination than earlier writers. They had the open-ended narratives with multiple interpretations. For example, James Joyce Ulysses incorporates distinctive open-ended symbols in each character. Formalism is also a characteristic of modernist period. Writers of the modernist period saw literature more as a craft, and they can think that they should use creativity. They believed that poems and novels were constructed from smaller parts instead of the organic internal process. The idea of literature as a craft, modernist desire for creativity and originality. Modernist poetry often includes foreign languages, dense vocabulary, and invented words. The poet E. Cummings abandoned all structure and spread his words all across the page. Stream of consciousness. A stream of consciousness was a phrase used by William James in his Principle of Psychology to describe the unbroken flow of perception, thoughts, and feelings in the waking mind. It adapted to describe a narrative method in modern fictions. Willie James had a little theory called radical empiricism, which sheds doubt on the existence of a unified self. In normal people speak, this means that I, you were 5 years ago or even 5 minutes ago, is not the same I you were now. We are all a series of selves, and that the self cannot be disentangled from the world. In other words, we are what we see. William James' theories about the nature of consciousness that had a much greater influence on the way of modernist literature. Renaissance humanism. Humanism was a European intellectual, philosophical, and cultural movement initiated in Italy and then expanded throughout Western Europe between the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries. In this, one was looked for a return to the models of classical antiquity and the Greco Roman humanism. This movement arose in response to the doctrine of utilitarianism. Humanists sought to create citizens who were able to express themselves orally and in writing. Longingness. Longingness is also one of the characteristics in modern literature. It was the main root of modern literature. Modern poets express longingness in all kinds in their poetry. Rupert Brooks' Old Vicarage is a cry of homesicknesses. John Masfield's Seekers is the best example of longing of a man for God and the eternal city of light. The longingness is also evident in The Hollow Man and The Wasteland of T.S. Eliot. Modern novels and the novelist. We are going to learn about the modern novels and novelist. One way to understand the modern novel is to find out its development in the work of writers such as Joseph Conrad, Markel Proust, James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, Frank Kafka, and William Faulkner. This list is by no means of exclusive, but it represents those authors who are essential figure of the modernist literary canon. Along with their modernist contemporaries, Conrad, Proust, Joyce, Woolf, Kafka, and Wagner are modern because they share certain literary preoccupation with an unstable modern world, have a diminishing belief in the idea of progress. A paramount concern to modernists is the questions of how the world is perceived. Thus, the modern novel relies on stream of consciousness, narrators, and even unreliable witnesses to the present and the past, underscoring the strenuous effort by novelist and reader alike to arrive at a semblance of the truth. The modern novel, in other words, as an thrust, a dynamic questioning of what it characters know and how they think they know it. Now we are going to learn about the few novelists who are really famous in the modern period. Joseph Conrad, his period was 1857 to 1924. Many commentators on the modern novel date its inception to World War One and its aftermath. 19th century writers and readers believed were universal and enduring. The basic element of modernism, however, evolved earlier. They appeared in Joseph Conrad's early work completed before World War One. Conrad experienced a sort of displacement and disorientations that are hallmarks of high modernism. That is, of novels that inquire into the foundation of civilization, the core belief and the modes of perception that 19th century novelists took for granted are only fitfully questions. This was the time when Charles Darwin's Karl Marx and Sigmund Freud first began to undermine the Victorian confidence in a coherent universe. Conrad grew up in Russian occupied Poland, the son of an improvised Polish nobleman who wrote political plays and was persecuted by the Russians. Early on, Conrad observed the devastating history of Poland, an enlightened country that had been partitioned by the Russia, Prussia, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and had risen against its oppressors in several futile rebellions. Conrad left his native land and went to sea, deserting several years later to re-establish himself in England and pursue writing as a career. Conrad doubted the Victorian notion of progress. His novels, such as Art of Darkness, reminded the British that their island nation had once been a part of Roman Empire, and that British movement in history, its pride in the achievements of imperialism, might be just that a movement. Central America, even as European and American, invested in undeveloped countries and deluded themselves into believing their presence would result in a socially, economically, and politically improved world. Second author is Charlie Marlowe. Conrad's narrator in A Heart of Darkness, Victory, and other works is a essential modernist because he cannot complacently accept a civilization like his contemporaries. His views are anti heroic and anti romantic. He questions 19th century hero worship, which led Romantic and Victorian writers such as Thomas Carlyle and Ralph Aldous Emerson to argue that history is made by great men and that history itself is just a sum of innumerable biography of great men. As a representative of a Western civilization attempting to bring its value to the so called savages in Africa. Conrad's contribution to the modern novel is enormous. He brought a brooding, musing sensibility to narrative and an awareness of the way human consciousness feeds on itself and elaborates whole words rather than just describing them. The great tradition of 19th century was realism. The novelist attempted to accurately convey the world and render its complexity. The focal point, in other words, was the world, not human consciousness, although certain late 19th century writers such as Henry James began to demonstrate that it was the narrator, as much as or more than the story he or she had to tell, who was the cynosure of fiction. James narrators such as Lampert Structure in The Ambassadors, written in 1903, anticipate the next major development in the modern novel, which occurs in the work of Marcel Proust. Second author was Marcel Proust. Like Conrad, Marcel Proust grew up in an atmosphere of social upheaval. The Commune of Paris, a popular uprising for more democratic government, failed in the year of novelist birth, and France had been defeated in war by Prussia. Like Conrad, Proust relied on the supple and subtle perception of the narrator to convey a conception of society and history as a construct, an extension of human ego filtered through sensibility of the artist. Unlike the realist, in other words, Proust was not merely imitating nature to render an accurate picture of it. Rather, he heightened sense through an exquisite attention to style, diction, imagery, and the rhythm of his prose. Proust's masterpiece, Remembrance of Things Past, written in 1913, is a standard modernist work focusing on time and history as subject in themselves. Proust's narrator is concerned not solely with his memories, but with the way he remembers and with how others formulate the sense of the past and present. In Proust, human identity itself becomes a product of language, and thus the artist becomes not merely a reporter, as in the realist traditions, but also a symbolist, that is, the writer pauses on those objects, scenes, and anecdotes that are shaped to define the way his or her characters live and think of their life. James Joyce. His period was 1882 to 1941. In a portrait of the artist as a young man, James Joyce extended the Proustian effect to render reality as it appeared to human consciousness by resorting to different linguistic registers with their own vocabulary and grammar. The child Stephen Dedulus emerges with his own language in the opening passage about him. Joyce is not merely describing a child's world and are picturing that world from the child's point of view, as Charles Dickens does in Great Expectation. On the contrary, Joyce inhabits a child world using the child word and praises to create a sense of immediacy of what critics have called a stream of consciousness. Reality is not there to be observed, but rather to be created in the child mind. Stephen is the artist, already making up stories in his unusual style. The modern novelist captures the fluid nature of perception as it is enacted in the mind. The most conspicuous example of Jaikan stream of consciousness is Molly Bloom's famous soliloquy. At the end of Ulysses, Joyce darlingly delves in the Molly's private thought and feelings. Her constant repetition of the word yes to convey her obsessive desire shocked many of the Joyce's contemporaries. He was breaking new ground in fiction, announcing it in effect that what made the novel modern was the novelist's willingness to deal explicitly with the subjects that heretofore had been deemed illicit and the province of pornographers. Joyce, however, believed that the novelist should not shy away from any feeling or desire expressed by his or her characters, even if this meant that his or her work would be censored. Ulysses could not be legally published in the United States until 1933, when a court lifted the ban on the novel. Joyce's modernism is defined then not only by his method of narration but also his subject matter. Women, as fully active, demanding sexual creatures and who tell stories from their own point of view and with their own words. The hero of Ulysses, Leopold Bloom, a Dublin Jew, is only a conventional male protagonist. He is rather what some critics have called an anti hero because he engages in no daring action and is not a leader of society or a military figure. He is outwardly unremarkable. What makes him noteworthy? The attention Joyce devotes to Bloom, including to his lively inner life. In other words, the modern hero or anti hero acquires his or her status through the energy and the imagination of the novelist, inverts him or her, and not as the result of record of accomplishment. Bloom is the common man as hero, making up the story of his own life as he lives it. Like Proust, Joyce exercised a sort of sovereignty over his material, superiority over the requirements of both classical literature. Joyce's characters are alluring not because of what they do, but because of the way Joyce invents them, endowing them with an interior language rather than just with certain mannerism and tics. The internals of the characters that Dickens, for instance, was so adept at creating. From the male point of view, notwithstanding a sensitive creation of characters like Molly Bloom and Jetty McDowell in Ulysses, one of the Joyce's contemporaries, Virginia Woolf, wished to remake the modern novel so that it more fully reflected women's creativity in narratives that questions the conventional ordering of history and the traditional gender relationship. Virginia Woolf was the famous person in the modern day period. Virginia Woolf sought to bring a full weight of women concern and talents to the development of modern novel. She rejected the rigid hierarchy of male dominated society and sought in her own fiction to portray women as proactive as maker of the world. She admired women writers and artists such as her contemporaries Rebecca West and Vanisha Bill and based her eponymous heroine Orlando on Bill Orlando, a biography in 1928, is a essential modernist novel that violates the standards of realistic fiction even as it mimics and burlesque biography, one of the most conventional literary genre that depends on line and development and chronological storytelling. Orlando undergoes gentle reassignment from a man to a woman, best maintained in her 1928 essay on Woolf, I Fountain of Genius, that this passages made up the heart of novel because Woolf was debating how far one's sex is like a pair of faulty glasses on one's nose, where one looks at the universe, how true it is that to be a woman is to have a blind spot on the northwest. To be a man is to see light as darkness east by south. In other words, Woolf was incorporating in her exploration of gender a typically modern concern with perception. That Orlando gender itself transcended time was Woolf's way of exploring human identity in a context far larger than was available in the 19th century novel. Like Woolf, West employed the radical experimentation of modern novel to challenge the social and political convention of a patriarchal society. Wolf, West, and others, including Juno Barons, added a vital element to moral fictions, developing the Joyce and notion of how human identity develops from the creation of language and the artist's unique point of view. Franz Kafka. The aspect of modernism take on even greater political dimension in Franz Kafka novel, especially the trial. One of the most influential modernists, Kafka explored the terror of 20th century society in which an individual could be accused of a nameless crime and succumb to the bureaucratic maze of figures, institutions that prosecute him. To many critics, the arbitrary nature of the trial, the arcane procedures used to determine the victim's guilt, and the constant pressing of a case against the individual until he begins to believe himself guilty of the charges. The very idea of rational world is under attack in the trial, and the society seems like a modernist hell because there can be no standard judgment, no ethical code, by everyone is measured openly and fairly. Only the interest of state are important, and the sole criterion for the individual existence here whether he or she is deemed to have acted in conformity with the current line and the authorities of Kafka elaborated the modernist attack on universal truth and obliterated the basic on which society had been organized since the Enlightenment. The trial lives in a world, lives in a world that doesn't make sense to him and that cannot be explained in terms of his own failings or ignorance. William Faulkner's classic modernist novel, The Sound and the Fury, would seem to be a gloss on Kafka nihilism. The novel is narrated both by idiot named Bench and his highly intelligent brother Quinn. Harvard students who commit suicide after being tormented by the world that will not conform to his heroic expectations. The third part of the novel is narrated by Jason, the crass and the cynical brother who survives on sarcasm. The language of novel is brilliant, not only because of Faulkner finds such a distinctive voice for his narrator, but also because each narrator represents a different way of looking at the world. Jason, the realistic, simply accepts the status quo and looks for a way to profit from the weakness of others. Finally, the summary, the modern literature is different from other literature. It has come out of cruelty and bloodsheds, and it questions the existence of woman and God too. It presents human life as it is. Modern literature is the true criticism of life.